President Biden speaks out on student protests.
We are not an authoritarian nation where we silence people or squash dissent. The American people are heard. In fact, peaceful protest is in the best tradition of how Americans respond to consequential issues.
Plus, Odessa remains under attack.
14 people were injured and civil infrastructure damaged. In particular, the warehouses of the Nova Poshta post office.
And later, South Korea issues a warning to its diplomats. We'll get some insight on what's behind it. And the heat wave in Asia continues. Today is Thursday, May 2nd, and this is VOA's Flashpoint: Global Crises. Good evening, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Hundreds of helmeted police officers muscled their way into a central plaza of the University of California at Los Angeles early on Thursday to dismantle a pro-Palestinian protest camp. It's the same one that was attacked the previous night by pro-Israel supporters. The pre-dawn police crackdown marked the latest flashpoint for mounting tensions on U.S. college campuses, where protests over Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza have led to student clashes with each other, with their schools, and with law enforcement. Television footage showed protesters under arrest with their hands bound behind their backs with zip ties as police removed them from the UCLA campus. Loud explosions were heard during the clash from flashbang charges or stun grenades fired by police. UCLA officials said the campus would remain closed except for limited operations on Thursday and Friday. Meanwhile, across the country, police remained on Columbia University's campus even after clearing out the student protesters and their encampment. But questions remain about how the university and the students move forward. Tina Trin reports from New York.
The scene is startling at Columbia University, a completely empty lawn with no signs of students or their pro-Palestinian encampment, a space where dozens of tents recently stood, entirely cleared out. Overnight Wednesday, hundreds of New York City police officers moved in at the request of University President Manoush Shafik to remove and arrest protesters after a group took over an occupied Hamilton Hall, an academic building on campus. In a statement, Shafik said, "This turn of events has filled me with deep sadness. I'm sorry we reached this point." In total, 109 protesters were arrested and faced charges including trespassing, criminal mischief, and burglary. An additional 173 student protesters were arrested the same night at nearby City College. In a press briefing, New York City Mayor Eric Adams said events had progressed beyond peaceful protest.
There's nothing peaceful about barricading buildings, destroying property, or dismantling security cameras. We cannot allow what should be a lawful protest to turn into a violent spectacle that saves and serves no purpose.
But witnesses say the police response was disproportionate to the offense and just as violent, with at least one student seen lying unconscious on the ground during the police raid. Shafik has asked police to remain on campus until May 17th, 2 days after commencement ceremonies are scheduled to take place. Whether that move will restore calm or spark more unrest remains to be seen. Tina Trin, VOA News, New York.
It's not just American college students that are protesting. France is now seeing pro-Palestinian protests at universities as well. Lisa Bryant has the story from Paris.
Palestinian flags were out in force during this annual Workers' Day rally in the French capital. Protesters like university student Zinedine Amian are calling for an end to the war in Gaza and for a change in French policy.
We believe there's a genocide happening and it cannot continue that way. France has to take its responsibility, which is to hold the voice for peace and try to obtain a ceasefire, try to put pressure on Israel.
Amian joined demonstrations this week at the Sorbonne University in Paris, where he studies. The protests were broken up by police. That has not stopped the protest movement from growing and spreading to other universities in France. The war in Gaza is a particularly sensitive issue in France, which is home to Western Europe's largest communities of Jews and Muslims. The protests here began last week at Sciences Po, an elite Paris university where President Emmanuel Macron and his Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, studied. The head of the Paris region suspended the university's funding until calm and order were restored. Far-left lawmakers have supported the protest movement, but conservatives and the government have criticized what they consider excessive behavior. Lisa Bryant, VOA News, Paris.
Student protests continue around the world, including at 4 Australian schools, where students say they will permanently occupy university land until their demands for divestment are met. From Sydney, Phil Mercer has the story.
Australian students say they see themselves part of this global wave of pro-Palestinian activism. The protests have so far been peaceful, although some Jewish students say they feel intimidated by the rallies. In response, protest organisers said that anti-Semitism had no place in their campaign. Student activists at 4 Australian campuses want their universities to divest from all activities that support Israel, as well as a ceasefire and the end of Australian government ties to Israel. All 4 universities told local media they supported the rights of students and staff to protest peacefully in accordance with Australian law. Phil Mercer, VOA News, Sydney.
Back in Washington, reacting to the chaos at American colleges and universities and the political upheaval in its wake, President Biden addressed the press midday on Thursday.
I wanted to speak a few moments about what's going on our college campuses here. We've all seen the images, and they put to the test 2 fundamental American principles. The first is the right to free speech and for people to peacefully assemble and make their voices heard. The second is the rule of law. Both must be upheld. We are not an authoritarian nation where we silence people or squash dissent. The American people are heard. In fact, peaceful protest is in the best tradition of how Americans respond to consequential issues. But, neither are we a lawless country. We are a civil society, and order must prevail.
He added that violent protest is not protected. Peaceful protest is. Destroying property is not a peaceful protest. You're listening to Flashpoint Global Crises from the Voice of America. I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Intense heat continues across Asia. That story in a moment. First, though, a look at the war in Ukraine. And to begin looking at Ukraine, we start in Switzerland. Swiss President Viola Amherd announced today that Switzerland will host what she's calling the Summit on Peace in Ukraine. It begins June 15th in Bergenstock. Elsewhere, a Russian missile strike on Odessa injured 14 people, and President Zelensky announced new bilateral security agreements. VOA correspondent Anna Chernikova has those details from Kyiv.
Late Wednesday night, the Russian army attacked Odessa with ballistic missiles. Oleg Kiper, the head of Odessa local military administration, reported that 14 people were injured and civil infrastructure damaged. In particular, the warehouses of the Nova Poshta post office. The surrounding houses were affected by a blast wave. Nova Poshta Post Service reported that 15.5 tons of packages worth almost $80,000 were destroyed as a result of the Russian attack. The Ukrainian authorities called this attack yet another crime committed by Russia against the civilian population. President Zelensky reported that in April 2024 alone, Russia launched more than 300 missiles of various types, almost 300 Shahed drones, and more than 3,200 guided aerial bombs against Ukrainian civilians. Also, Zelensky said that Ukraine is preparing new bilateral security agreements with partners, which are designed for a long-term support of Kyiv.
Ми готуємо ще 7 нових безпекових документів для
We are
нашої
preparing
держави.
7 new security documents for our country, bilateral security agreements, including one with the United States. Weapons, finance, political cooperation. Today I worked with the team on specific details of these documents, and we already have preliminary texts of some of these agreements. Each of them will support us this year and the next ones. This is our security architecture for the period until we join NATO. We are filling the draft agreements with stronger opportunities for Ukraine and for our common security with partners. Obviously, any means of increasing our protection against Russian terror are given special priority.
Особливий пріоритет усьому, що дасть більше захисту від російського терору.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence reported that Russian forces are using drones over the nuclear reactors of the occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to attack nearby Ukrainian territories. Russians use the territory of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to launch UAVs, taking advantage of the fact that the Ukrainian forces cannot fire back in a 1.5-kilometer zone around the plant. According to the report, the flight paths of the drones run over the power units in the direction of the Nikopol and Marganets communities of the Dnipropetrovsk region, which are under constant Russian attacks. VOA cannot verify this information independently at this time. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
South Korea has issued a security alert to its diplomats across Asia that they might be the targets of a possible North Korean attack. This follows news that Seoul is in talks to join the AUKUS agreement. Are Seoul's deepening Western alliances causing the North to retaliate? My next guest doesn't think so. I'm joined by Alexis Dudden. She's a history professor at the University of Connecticut.
Actually, I see this all about economics. South Korea's president, Yoon, has a very low support rate, and his People Power Party suffered a crushing loss April 10th. And North Korea gets to be the boogeyman in South Korean politics. That is not to excuse, not to apologize for North Korea's exceptionally belligerent behavior. North Korea's economy is really bad too. And so both sides are using one another domestically. And so recalling diplomats from Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Vladivostok, and Shenyang, or issuing terror threats, it's not unprecedented, but it is playing in South Korea to helping President Yoon shore up a very dwindling base.
You do seem to be saying, though, that it really isn't as big a risk at the moment as the South is making it out to be.
This is for South Korean public consumption. And if there is a terrorist attack, it has far more to do with money laundering and attempts at gaining attention for domestic North Korean consumption, which is totally controlled, right? I mean, that's not a free media, but South Korea's curbs on its own media this year have been deeply alarming. Journalists have been arrested. And so this is because President Yoon's support rate is in the gutter. And again, the crushing defeat on April 10th, and the economy is not great. And people are protesting on the streets, both sides. But North Korea is the way to shore up support as a dog whistle.
Well, is it working, or has it worked for Yoon in the past?
Sure, because North Korea behaves so poorly and is completely, I mean, who would support North Korea in a democratic system? No one.
I think we'll leave the discussion of Korea there. I do have another question for you, having nothing at all to do with any of this, if that's okay.
Sure.
I read your bio on the UConn website, and it says you went to Columbia.
I did, and I'm wearing my Columbia sweatshirt right now.
Oh, terrific. Given what's going on there, Columbia's been in the news, as you know, for the student protests. What are your thoughts there? Columbia was a home to you. You walked across that quad. You took classes in those buildings. How does it feel to see it on TV like this?
I support the students in solidarity with the students and free speech. I am appalled by the current president and the faculty senate that called in the New York Police Department and did not allow reporters to cover this incident. So I am, as an alum and an occasional lecturer on campus, I'm not allowed on my alma mater's campus. And it's graduation season. And these kids, the seniors right now at Columbia, are the same kids who 4 years ago were unable to have a high school graduation because of COVID. They want graduation. They also want the right to free speech.
Alexis Dudden is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Elsewhere in Asia, sleepless nights and canceled classes as intense heat continues to bear down across South and Southeast Asia. VOA's Lori London reports.
Authorities have been issuing health alerts, particularly for the young and elderly, as the weeks-long heat wave sweeps across the region with no relief in sight. Cambodia's meteorological ministry said the country is facing the highest temperatures in 170 years. The sweltering heat prompted Cambodian schools to cut classes down by 2 hours Thursday, with temperatures expected to soar up to 39 degrees Celsius.
When the weather is so hot, it gives me a headache, and I have difficulty staying to finish the class.
Millions of students in all public schools across the Philippines were ordered to stay home this week amid heat wave alerts and warned of overloading on its power grid.
No face-to-face classes because it's so hard for especially in the elementary, the pupils to cope up with this kind of weather.
In eastern India, slum dwellers are bearing the brunt of the soaring temperatures.
We are struggling because of the heat. Despite our efforts to keep cool by pouring water on ourselves and on the ground, nothing is working. We can feel steam rising from the ground.
The Indian Meteorological Department said that the Gangetic Plains were some of the most severely affected regions by the ongoing heat wave in parts of the country.
Severe heat wave conditions are persisting for the last, since 15th of April, it is continuing. Odisha from 15th, Bengal from 17th. And severity has been more over Bengal, Gangetic West Bengal.
Scientists say climate change is partly responsible for more frequent, severe, and longer heat waves during summer. Lori London, VOA News, Washington.
Friday is World Press Freedom Day, and we're getting things started a day early here with the story of Chinese journalist Su Yutong. When she fled her home country in 2010, she thought she would find safety. But even in exile in Germany, the reporter is targeted by China. From Berlin, Liam Scott has the story.
Su Yutong has become a skilled chef. Cooking dishes she loved in Beijing connects the journalist with her home country and helps fill the long periods spent home alone. The reason for her self-imposed isolation: years of attacks and threats from China. Su says that because she keeps telling the truth, China wants to silence her, including by making threats. Sharing a banned book on Tiananmen Square back in 2010 began Su's troubles. Police raided her home in Beijing and held her under house arrest. But with the help of friends, she escaped to Europe. For a while, Germany's capital provided a sense of safety. Su wrote human rights stories for Deutsche Welle and then Radio Free Asia. But the sense of safety soon disappeared. In 2022, strange men started turning up at her building, brought there by an underground sex website that listed her address. Su says she was left feeling disgusted and humiliated. Her mental health suffered, and she says she was even afraid to walk down the street. The worst was yet to come. In 2023, assailants used Su and two Chinese activists' identities to book rooms at luxury hotels in Berlin and other cities. Then they called in fake bomb threats. Experts say that Su's case is extreme, even for Beijing, which ranks among the worst perpetrators of transnational repression. Mareike Oldberg is a China expert at the German Marshall Fund.
The basic tactics of transnational repression they're usually geared towards showing people that they can't get away from the Chinese government.
The driving goal, says Oldberg, is to stop any criticism of China overseas. Neither China's embassy in Berlin nor its foreign ministry responded to VOA's requests for comment. Being targeted is a lonely experience. Over a 2-year period, Sue barely left her apartment. She says even something as simple as a walk in the park can feel tinged with danger. Sue says she rarely went out, but when she did, she would always check for suspicious people. Such a response is typical, experts say. Guzda Bochu is a researcher at the Citizen Lab, which focuses on technology and human rights.
So paranoia is a common response across different communities, and often people fear that other actors or individuals within the community could spy on them, and these fears are not unfounded.
But now, Sue says she feels less afraid. Sue says China didn't expect her to come out of the shadows. She thinks they should be afraid, not her, saying, "They can't shut me up, they can't achieve this goal." Her life is fuller again, but Sue's apartment is still sparse. After the 2023 incidents, police recommended she move. When she did, she left nearly everything behind, except the tools she needed to keep reporting. Sue says that China blocks the truth, so it needs lots of journalists to tell the real stories, the real events, and the truth. In one way, says Sue, there's a sense of comfort in knowing that Beijing is scared too. If they weren't, Sue believes, they wouldn't try so hard to silence her. Liam Scott, VOA News, Berlin.
The average income of people around the world will be cut by 1/5 because of climate change by the middle of the century. This according to a new report by Germany's Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. It was published in the journal Nature. VOA's Henry Ridgwell has more.
In the Philippines this week, schools were closed as students and teachers were ordered to stay at home amid temperatures close to 40 degrees Celsius. As many parts of the world experience extreme weather, new research warns that the global impacts of a changing climate are set to cost $38 trillion a year by 2050. That means a reduction in the world's average income of some 19%. Those losses are locked in, says report co-author Maximilian Kotz.
What we find is that over the next 25 to 30 years, impacts on the economy are consistent across different emission scenarios, regardless of whether we enter a high emission or a low emission world.
Climate change, and especially higher temperatures, have been shown to impact worker productivity, says Kotz.
And that's going to then be manifest across numerous different industries, although it's particularly strong, those impacts when workers are outdoors, so in contexts like manufacturing sectors. And then we also know that impacts on agricultural productivity are very strong from, again, particularly high temperatures.
The research looked at climate and economic data from the past 40 years from more than 1,600 regions across the world and used it to assess future impacts. Those least responsible for global emissions are likely to be worst hit.
Regions in the global south are those which are most vulnerable and which are going to be most strongly affected by future climate change. And the simple reason for that is that these regions, they're already hotter.
The report concludes that tackling climate change would be far cheaper than putting up with the economic damage. It says the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be just a sixth of the $38 trillion impact of climate change by 2050. Henry Ridgwell, VOA News.
And that ends today's show. There's more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across our social media platforms. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thanks for listening. Until tomorrow, I'm Steve Karish.
For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.